Wednesday, 26th of July, 2023. On a quiet stretch of road in rural East Sussex, two vans were brought to a stop. Nothing about them stood out. What officers would uncover that day would take months to fully understand and years to unravel. 3 months later, Wednesday, 4th of October 2023, a shipment of fruit arrived in the UK, crates stacked with clean paperwork. The kind of delivery that passed through ports every single day. By the time it reached a Tyre yard in Bradford, something hidden deep inside had already changed hands and triggered a chain of arrests that would stretch across the city. Then, in the early hours of Wednesday, the 27th of November 2024, across Warrington, officers moved quickly through the properties, seizing mobile phones, cash, and other items linked to the group. What they recovered was never meant to be seen outside that circle. Drugs, large sums of money, and a feud that was beginning to move closer to violence. At first glance, these moments had nothing to do with each other, but behind the scenes, they all followed the same pattern, until a single break exposed everything. This is the story of 3 major drug conspiracies, and how they were dismantled piece by piece. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. If we talk about the first story, the routes were not improvised. They were chosen because they looked ordinary. Movements that happened every day through ports that processed thousands of vehicles without pause. Nothing about the operation depended on speed or force, instead depended on being forgettable. One route relied on a motorhome crossing the North Sea from Rotterdam to Hull. The crossing itself raised no suspicion. It was used daily by tourists, tradespeople, and long-distance travelers. Inside the vehicle, however, compartments had been deliberately adapted. Black bin bags filled with ketamine were sealed away in spaces never meant to be opened, carried across the water without drawing attention. Once the ferry docked, the motorhome did not linger. It was driven inland, away from the port, before anything was unloaded. Reports suggested that it was a crucial part of the operation, and one that would soon draw attention to Russell King and the role he played behind the scenes. But we will talk about it in a few minutes. Running alongside that was a larger and more ambitious method. Commercial lorries entered the UK through Newhaven port, arriving from mainland Europe with loads that appeared legitimate. Cardboard boxes were stacked, wrapped, and documented like any other delivery. To inspectors, they looked routine. However, inside, they were anything but. Cocaine and ketamine were concealed to resemble standard freight, packed carefully for long journeys and designed to survive multiple handovers. Crucially, the drugs were never meant to stay on those vehicles for long. After arrival, the loads were moved quickly. Transfers took place at secluded rural locations, chosen for their isolation rather than convenience. Movements were kept short and controlled. Vans were used only long enough to receive the load, after which they were quickly moved on. The pattern was simple and repeatable. Nothing about the operation felt rushed, and that was the point. The planning relied on familiarity, with roads, with ports, with timing. And for a long time, it worked. Until one journey didn't. And the first crack appeared in a system far larger than anyone initially realized. Russell King did not sit at the edge of the operation. He sat near the center of it. To investigators, it quickly became clear that he was far more than a man moving drugs from one place to another. His role was logistical, organized, and sustained over time. At 63 years old, King did not fit the stereotype of a street-level dealer. He operated quietly, coordinating movements, timings, and handovers. Evidence showed he was trusted with large quantities of drugs and critical stages of the supply chain. When consignments moved, his involvement was rarely accidental. He knew each step exactly, like where they came from, who was transporting them, and where they were going next. In July 2023 alone, King was linked to the importation of 632 kilograms of ketamine into the UK. The scale of that single shipment placed him firmly in the upper tier of the operation. And that is not the end of his role. Reports confirm, just 1 month earlier, he had also been involved in bringing 70 kilograms of cannabis into the country, showing that the activity was ongoing and diversified rather than focused on a single load. By August 2024, his involvement had not slowed. Officers arrested King while he was unloading 100 kilograms of ketamine with an estimated street value of £2 million from his motorhome. It was not a transit stop or a contingency plan. It was the final stage of another planned delivery. Investigators also established that King traveled to mainland Europe to oversee preparation. He met directly with lorry drivers in France, where drugs were loaded into vehicles before crossing into the UK. His presence at that stage showed a level of authority and responsibility that went beyond simple transportation. Digital evidence reinforced that picture. Multiple chat threads recovered from his mobile phone were titled "Load, Load Tonight," and "Loading." These were not casual conversations. They pointed to repeated importations, coordinated schedules, and a system refined over time. The language, frequency, and structure of the messages made one thing clear. This was not a one-off offense, but part of a long-running operation. But King was not acting alone. The messages revealed another figure, operating at a distance whose influence stretched even further, and whose control did not stop at the prison gates. By the time Russell King was moving vehicles and overseeing loads on the continent, the overall direction of the operation was coming from somewhere far less visible. Arturas Jusas was not traveling, meeting drivers, or crossing borders. He was doing something far more difficult to detect. Jusas was operating from inside HMP High Point in Suffolk, where he was already serving a 9-year and 9-month sentence for conspiring to traffic 69 illegal migrants into the UK by boat. Despite his imprisonment, investigators established that he remained actively involved in organizing large-scale drug importations from Europe. Using mobile phones, Jusas maintained contact with trusted associates on the outside. The messages showed him coordinating key elements of the operation rather than reacting to events as they happened. He gave instructions on how drugs should be packaged to blend in with legitimate freight, how vehicles should be loaded to avoid suspicion, and how movements should be timed to reduce the risk of detection at ports and border controls. He also went further than managing his own network. Evidence revealed that Jusas was offering a transportation service to other organized crime groups, effectively turning the route into a business model. For a fee, his network would move large quantities of cocaine and ketamine from mainland Europe into the UK using methods already proven to work. Within the encrypted chat groups, Jusas did not dominate conversations. He was often silent, observing rather than speaking. But investigators identified him as the controller behind the scenes, the person with the authority to approve movements and resolve problems. His influence was understood without needing constant instruction. The scale of his involvement made one point unmistakable. Incarceration had not removed his control. It had merely changed how he exercised it. That arrangement would only come to light once a single journey failed, drawing attention to a network far larger than anyone initially suspected. The operation began to unravel on Wednesday, the 26th of July, 2023. On the A26 near Maresfield in East Sussex, officers stopped 2 vans travelling inland. At the time of the stop, there was nothing to suggest the scale of what was about to be uncovered. Inside the vehicles, officers found drugs concealed in a way designed to withstand long-distance transport. When the search was completed, the total haul amounted to 70 kilograms of cocaine and 632 kilograms of ketamine. The estimated street value of the seizure was £24.5 million, immediately marking it out as one of the most significant drug finds in the region. Further inquiries traced the shipment back to a lorry driven by Pavel Butsko, which had entered the UK earlier that day. The lorry had arrived via Newhaven Port, using the same route. Once off the ferry, the load was not taken directly to a warehouse or distribution centre. Instead, it was moved quickly to a nearby location where the drugs were transferred into the 2 vans that were later stopped on the A26. The speed of the offload was deliberate. The aim was to distance the original vehicle from the drugs as soon as possible, reducing the risk that a single interception could expose the wider route. But this time, the timing failed. Intelligence had already been developed, and officers were in position before the vans could move further inland. The scale of the seizure led Sussex police to describe it as the largest drug seizure ever made in the county. What initially appeared to be a routine vehicle stop had, in a matter of hours, exposed an operation responsible for moving hundreds of kilograms of drugs into the UK. And as investigators began to examine how the vans had reached that road, the focus quickly shifted away from the drivers and towards the communication networks that had made the journey possible. What investigators recovered from those seized devices proved just as significant as the drugs themselves. At the center of the communications was a private WhatsApp group titled Unload 1. Analysis showed it had been created specifically for the importation that took place on the 26th of July 2023. It was not a general chat or a long-running group. Its sole purpose was to coordinate the arrival, transfer, and onward movement of that single shipment. The members of the group were quickly identified. Charlotte Moore and Stephen Norris were involved in the collection and movement of the drugs once they reached the UK. Andrew Gudds and Ihor Korobets appeared as trusted participants connected to both logistics and finance. Russell King was present as the organizer overseeing the process. And linked quietly within the group was Arturas Jussas, what we have all discussed earlier. The phones revealed more than messages. Forensic work uncovered DNA evidence connecting individuals to an earlier attempted importation in May 2023, showing that the July run was not isolated. On another device, officers found evidence of a £20,000 cash handover, which led to a separate money laundering arrest and tied financial activity directly back to the drugs operation. What emerged was a layered system. Messages were brief, functional, and timed around movements rather than conversations. Each phone had a purpose, and each participant understood only their part of the process. By this stage, the evidence had gone far beyond the seizure on the A26. Investigators were no longer dealing with one failed delivery, but with a network that had been running repeatedly, quietly, and with confidence. The next step was inevitable. Police conducted all of the remaining arrests to shift the case towards its final conclusion. The case was heard at Lewis Crown Court in 2024, where prosecutors set out all the details of the operation with overwhelming evidence that we have already discussed earlier. There were no successful defenses disputing the existence of the conspiracy. One defendant, Abdul Surabi, was acquitted after trial, with the jury finding insufficient evidence to prove possession with intent to supply. All other defendants were convicted either after trial or guilty pleas. In sentencing remarks, the court described the operation as a significant international supply chain responsible for moving large quantities of drugs into the UK, noting the scale of ketamine involved and the level of organisation required to sustain it. Following the verdicts, officers from Sussex Police and the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit said the investigation had dismantled a major European supply route and highlighted the growing threat posed by organised crime groups using prison-based command structures. They warned that ketamine use was increasing and stressed that coordinated multi-agency enforcement would continue to target those involved at every level of the supply chain. Charlotte Moore, 32, of Middleburg Street, Hull, was sentenced to 13 years imprisonment. Stephen Norris, 36, also of Middleburg Street, Hull, was convicted of the same offences and sentenced to 10 years. Pavel Budsko, 50, of no fixed address, was convicted of fraudulent evasion of the prohibition on the importation of cocaine and ketamine and sentenced to 9 years. Kirill Lapsu, 42, of no fixed address, was convicted of the same offences and sentenced to 9 years. Andrew Gudds, 39, of Wards Wharf Approach, London, was convicted of conspiracy to import Class A and Class B drugs and sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. Ihor Korobets, 42, of Ward's Wharf Approach, London, was sentenced to 16 years. Russell King, 63, formerly of the Green, Royston, Essex, was sentenced to 22 years imprisonment. Whereas Arturas Jusas pleaded guilty to conspiracy to import cocaine and ketamine, but at the time of sentencing for the rest of the group, his punishment for the drugs offences had not yet been handed down. His sentencing was formally adjourned and listed for a later date, which had not been set at the time of reporting in any source I have checked. The shipment arrived in the UK on Wednesday, the 4th of October 2023. On paper, it was unremarkable. A consignment of papaya fruit imported from Mexico, part of the constant flow of fresh produce entering the country every day. The paperwork was clean, the route was established, and nothing about it suggested risk. Hidden beneath the top trays of fruit, however, was something else entirely. Concealed deep within the pallets were vacuum-packed parcels of cocaine, each wrapped tightly in half-kilo blocks. The drugs were positioned low in the load, buried under layers of produce designed to discourage inspection and mask scent. It was a method chosen for its simplicity. Fruit shipments move fast, they are time-sensitive, and rarely delayed without cause. After arrival in the UK, the consignment did not travel directly north. Instead, it followed a deliberate, stepped route. From the point of entry at the airport, the pallets were transported southeast to a commercial depot in Slough. The stop created distance between the port of entry and the final destination. From Slough, the load was collected and driven north to Bradford. There, it was taken to a Tyre yard, and we will talk about this in a few minutes. By the time the drugs were removed, the papayas had already served their purpose. The concealment method had worked exactly as intended to move a large quantity of Class A drugs across international borders under the appearance of legitimate trade. It would have continued unnoticed had it not been for what happened next, when the shipment was broken down, divided, and moved again, exposing the people waiting further up the chain. Once the consignment reached Bradford, it was taken away from main roads and into the Low Moor area, where the lorry was directed to a Tyre yard already under the control of those running the operation. The location was private, familiar, and provided a controlled environment where the load could be handled without interruption. The yard was linked to Levi Depas, who prosecutors later identified as one of the principal organizers of the conspiracy. From that point on, the shipment was no longer part of an international importation. It had entered the domestic phase of the supply chain. Inside the yard, the pallets were opened and the process began. The cocaine was separated from the papaya fruit, removed from the trays, and brought out of concealment for the first time since leaving South America. The load was split almost immediately. This was a deliberate safeguard. By dividing the drugs into smaller quantities, the group reduced the risk that a single police intervention would lead to the loss of the entire shipment. It also allowed the cocaine to move in different directions at the same time, making detection and interception more difficult. For a short window, the Tyre yard functioned as a temporary distribution hub, but splitting the load also created exposure. Every handover, every vehicle, and every driver introduced another point of vulnerability. And it was during those next movements, away from the yard and into the wider city, that the operation began to fracture. The first transfer involved 35 kilograms, which was handed over to Adil Ditta. His role was to take the drugs away from the site and push them further along the chain. Police were already watching. As officers moved in to make an arrest, Ditta attempted to flee. A pursuit followed, ending with his VW Golf abandoned and the drugs left inside. The vehicle was recovered and the cocaine seized. What was meant to be a routine handover had become the first clear fracture in the operation. The remaining 57 kilograms of cocaine had already been set in motion. That portion of the load was transported separately. driven away from Low Moor and towards the Shipley area using a different route and a different driver. The split was intended to limit losses. Instead, it multiplied the points of failure. That second vehicle was driven by Gary Sinclair. He was stopped by police before the drugs could be moved on. Inside the car, officers recovered the cocaine along with material that showed it had been recently imported, linking the drugs directly back to the earlier papaya shipment. As the seizures mounted, investigators turned to the digital trail left behind. Telephone data recovered from the suspects confirmed the hierarchy at work, showing who had given instructions, who had received them, and how movements were coordinated. Messages and call patterns tied the drivers back to those controlling the yard and, further up the chain, to those directing the operation as a whole. By the end of that day, the cocaine had been stopped before it could reach wider circulation. But for police, the significance went far beyond the drugs seized. The interventions had exposed the structure behind the movement, and with that structure now visible, attention shifted to the organizers who believed they were safely removed from the risks on the ground. At the center was Sanchez Heffernan, identified by police as the principal organizer. He was described as the figure directing the conspiracy, making decisions about when loads would move, where they would be taken, and who would handle them at each stage. Prosecutors said he exercised control rather than carrying out hands-on work, distancing himself from the drugs while retaining oversight of the entire operation. Directly beneath him sat Levi DePass and Matthew Jackson, both characterized as senior managers within the network. We already discussed the role of DePass, and Jackson operated alongside him, relaying instructions, coordinating couriers, and ensuring that movements happened in line with Heffernan's direction. Together, they formed the layer that translated strategy into action. Jack Stalley occupied a lower but essential role. He acted as a courier, traveling under direct instruction to collect and move the consignment once it entered the UK. The group also relied on the use of legitimate businesses as cover, embedding criminal activity within ordinary commercial settings. This allowed drugs to be stored, moved, and concealed without immediately attracting attention, and helped blur the line between lawful trade and organized crime. Investigators further linked the conspiracy to earlier EncroChat activity, including connections to the Handle Grave Jaguar, tying members of the group to historic drug supply offenses dating back to 2020. Before the full conspiracy was brought before the court, parts of the operation had already been dealt with through earlier prosecutions. Those cases focused on the individuals caught moving the drugs. Gary Sinclair was the first to be sentenced. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Dominic Lowe followed. He had been observed handing over 35 kilograms of cocaine taken from the yard and was later convicted of supplying Class A drugs. He received a sentence of 8 years. Adil Dita was also convicted. He admitted possession with intent to supply and was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. It was at this stage that West Yorkshire Police's Programme Precision team expanded the investigation into a full conspiracy case. The case returned to court for final sentencing at Bradford Crown Court, where the full scale of the conspiracy was laid out before the judge. Sanchez Heffernan, 34, formerly of Denholme, Bradford, was sentenced to 29 years imprisonment. Levi DePass, 37, formerly of Westroyd Road, Shipley, was sentenced to 27 years. The court also imposed a further 13-year sentence for an earlier cocaine supply offence to run concurrently. Matthew Jackson, 35, formerly of Villa Road, Bingley, was sentenced to 17 years imprisonment, having been described as a trusted lieutenant who played a significant role in directing activity on the ground. Jack Stalley, 34, formerly of Allerton, Bradford, was sentenced to 13 years. Together, the sentences imposed on the 4 men totaled 86 years imprisonment. The third story starts with the investigation known as Operation Havoc, led by Cheshire Police and focused on a Warrington-based organised crime group operating at scale across the northwest. What officers uncovered was not an informal street-level setup, but a structured network built around encrypted communication and long-established supply lines. At the center of the group was Nathan Simpson, who operated under the EncroChat handle Gardenfella. He was identified as the overall controller responsible for directing drug supply, managing money, and overseeing the movement of both people and product. Beneath Simpson sat two key lieutenants. Nathan Davies, using the handle Chillerfella, worked closely with Simpson as a key operational link. He coordinated the sourcing of cannabis, arranged collections, and was involved in the production of a potent cannabis extract known as shatter. Davies was in frequent contact with suppliers and was trusted to handle sensitive aspects of the operation without supervision. Alongside him was John Lally, known on EncroChat as Silverfella. Lally focused on money movement and cocaine logistics. He was involved in directing the transport of large quantities of drugs and cash, ensuring payments were made and debts collected. His messages showed a focus on maintaining order within the network and responding quickly when problems emerged. Further down the chain, Stephen Dodd and Dominic Bourdet both operated the EncroChat handle Sticky Green at different times. Their role was operational. They attended meetings to exchange multi-kilogram quantities of drugs for cash, held access to stash locations, and facilitated the movement of cocaine and cannabis on behalf of the group. When dissatisfaction grew with Dodd's performance, Bourdet was brought in to take over the role. The group relied almost entirely on EncroChat encrypted phones, believing the platform gave them secrecy and protection from law enforcement. Through these devices, they arranged the purchase and movement of cocaine, cannabis, and amphetamine, often discussing quantities in the multi-kilogram range. The drugs themselves were sourced from multiple cities, primarily Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham. From there, they were moved into Warrington and surrounding areas, where they were either supplied wholesale or broken down for onward distribution. The network's reach extended beyond Cheshire, but its control remained tightly held within a small group at the top. What made the organisation effective was not just access to supply, but discipline. Roles were defined, communication was controlled, and information was shared only on a need-to-know basis. For a time, that structure allowed the group to operate with confidence, unaware that the very system they relied on to stay hidden was already being dismantled. As officers analysed the EncroChat data, the true scale of the operation began to emerge. It was a sustained supply network, moving large quantities of drugs over an extended period. Experts assessed that the group had been involved in the supply of approximately 115.283 kilograms of cannabis, 10.982 kilograms of cocaine, and 63.44 kilograms of amphetamine. These figures were based on message content, financial records, and corroborating evidence gathered during the investigation, and were accepted by the court as representative of the conspiracy's scope. Financial analysis revealed that during the EncroChat period examined, the group had turned over £328,230, with a further £239,100 still owed for drugs supplied on credit. Messages showed regular discussions about debts, payments, and shortfalls, indicating a business model built on trust, pressure, and enforcement rather than casual exchange. The network operated on two levels. At the higher end, drugs were supplied wholesale, moving in bulk quantities to other dealers. At street level, the group also controlled local deal lines, particularly for cannabis. One line, linked to Connor Lawton, was described as selling 4 to 5 ounces of cannabis a day, broken down into 20-pound bags. It was a steady, reliable source of daily income rather than a one-off windfall. To support this volume, the group made use of multiple stash houses across Warrington. These properties were used to store drugs, cash, and equipment, allowing supplies to be rotated and moved quickly if police attention increased. The picture that emerged was of an operation run with consistency and intent, and as the money flowed, so did the tensions that came with protecting it. Running alongside the drug supply was a growing feud that pushed the group into far more dangerous territory. The rivalry centered on Leon Cullen and his associates, figures already known to police for serious organized crime across the Northwest. What began as online provocation quickly escalated into discussions of violence. The trigger was a taunting Instagram account set up under the name Leon Official, which added Daniel Roberts and appeared to mock the Simpson Group. Messages recovered from EncroChat showed the impact was immediate. Simpson shared the posts with his lieutenants, and suspicion hardened into belief that Cullen or those acting for him were deliberately provoking a confrontation. From there, the tone of the messages changed. Discussions moved beyond drugs and money to explicit references to violence. The group spoke about shooting rivals in the leg, about burning down homes and business premises, and about drive-by shootings aimed at sending a message rather than killing outright. Lally encouraged arson attacks, while Davies and Simpson discussed whether to collect weapons in response to the perceived threat. Crucially, the court heard that Simpson and Davies did have access to firearms. Messages showed they were prepared to use them if they believed an attack was imminent. On 10th April 2020, Simpson was issued with a threat-to-life notice, prompting a visible police presence designed to deter disorder and prevent retaliation. Prosecutors accepted that much of the language used in the messages was posturing, driven by anger and paranoia rather than immediate plans. But the risk lay elsewhere. The group's access to weapons was real, and the willingness to discuss their use marked a dangerous shift in the operation. The operation moved into its enforcement phase in the early hours of Wednesday, the 27th of November, 2024. Across Warrington, officers executed coordinated dawn raids at multiple addresses linked to the group. Inside the homes, police recovered a wide range of evidence. Drugs and cash were seized. Officers also found designer watches and high-value clothing, items prosecutors later described as the visible proceeds of the drug trade. At one address, weapons and knives were also discovered. At John Lally's address, officers recovered a Ducati motorbike worth around £14,000, which had been reported stolen from Liverpool several weeks earlier. The discovery led to an additional charge of handling stolen goods, adding to the seriousness of his case. 6 members of the group were arrested during the Warrington raids. Connor Lawton was not present at the time. He was located and arrested days later on the 6th of December 2024 after landing at Manchester Airport. Like most of the others, he made no comment during the police interview. With arrests completed and devices seized, investigators now shifted this case towards its final conclusion. The case concluded at Liverpool Crown Court in July 2025, where all 7 men appeared for sentencing after pleading guilty to their roles in the conspiracy. The court confirmed that Proceeds of Crime Act hearings would follow at a later date, where judges will determine how much of the group's profits can be recovered. Nathan Simpson, 33, of Birtles Road, Warrington, was sentenced to 16 years and 2 months. Nathan Davies, 33, of Hume Street, Warrington, received 9 years and 8 months. John Lally, 33, of Fairclough Street, Warrington, was sentenced to 12 years and 4 months. Further down the hierarchy, Stephen Dodd, 33, of Watkin Street, Warrington, received 6 years and 9 months. Dominic Bourdet, 40, of Thelwall Lane, was sentenced to 3 years and 8 months, whereas Daniel Roberts, 34, of Sandfield Crescent, received 3 years and 6 months, while Connor Lawton, 30, was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months. In total, the sentences amounted to 55 years and 5 months imprisonment. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.